Very good. Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. First time in Bosnia, and I'm super excited, and I'm looking forward to tomorrow when I have some time off to explore the city. So please come also back and let me know what I should visit then. As several of us already said, it's really, now we'll see if this one is working. No. We would like to thank all the sponsors for giving Agile Bosnia the opportunity to arrange this conference. Now, I'm going to throw you into complexity today. So it's a brilliant opportunity right after lunch, right? I love this quote. And I'm hoping to guide you a little bit through the idea of complexity and what role it plays in terms of scaling Agile. So, crash course. Complexity. There is no general agreement, first of all, about complexity. However, generally it is used to characterize something with many parts that interacts in many ways. And complex systems, by looking at complexity, we use often systems to understand the idea, how it works. And there is a particular type of complex systems. You know, we have biological, we have physical, and we have social complex systems. And I'm going to focus on the last one here today. And many times we talk about that in terms of complex adaptive systems, which are open evolutionary systems. And the thing is here that the components or inherent parts of that interact intensely in a self-organizing way, and also adapts and evolves, emerges its behavior with the change. Sounds like Agile, right? But more importantly, to survive as a complex adaptive system, you need to look at it as a whole. The system as a whole must adapt to the change. Now, we already heard in the morning about sub-optimizing. Thank you, Rainer, for bringing that up. And you're all probably all familiar with that in terms of you focus on one part and not understanding the part and its effects on other parts of your system. Now, what is more interesting, that complexity has now also, I mean, originally it comes from mathematics, but now growing into a field of complexity science, we look at systems, even the social ones, and it has pulled together an interdisciplinary, basis for understanding even organizations as complex systems. And it's a growing body, and what is very interesting here, it fundamentally changes the way we look at our organizations. This is happening in the management and organizational sciences in particular, but it's bringing together several different disciplines to understand the interactions between, specifically the interactions between those component parts of the system. And that is tricky. But what it really does is that it states that we need to fundamentally change the way we look at our organizations, and by that shift the way we lead, operate, and evolve. And coming back to the first quote, this is an interesting paradigm shift, because traditionally we have relied as managers. Now, I should also point out that we're looking at the management level here, the leaders of our organizations. So I'm not going to focus so much on programming or the tech stuff, more on how we lead our organizations, our software development, our product development organizations in the 21st century. So we are letting go of traditional, non-linear, and reductionist, mechanistic ways of leading our organizations. And it's funny, because about a decade ago, I stood up at conferences and I said, well, we have to fundamentally change the way we look at the way we develop software. And now I'm talking about and saying mostly the same words, but now looking at the management level in terms of scaling Agile, beyond the team and project levels. And we have heard very inspiring talks already about this morning from Scott and Rainer. So, complexity science, across the frontiers of science, a new whole systems approach is evolving, and by that replacing all ways of leading organizations. And how could we understand the complexity, and how could we do that effectively as leaders? That is what I hope to bring some light to today. Now, complex adaptive systems. I'd actually like to ask someone to volunteer to come up and help me draw up a complex adaptive system. Anybody? Yeah, come up. Thank you. Now, and the instruction now, very prescriptive. Oh, you should get the pen. Yeah, you have it right there. How do we visualize complexity? Can we do that in order to help us understand what it looks like? Now, if you were to follow these three basic characteristics of complex adaptive systems, that means they are nonlinear, open, and dynamic. So we start with the open one.
I should paint a picture of open.
Yes. Open system interact with its environment, receiving inputs, providing outputs, but doesn't control its environment.
I tried.
That is absolutely brilliant. Woo! You have a good piece of art here. You need to sign that. Well, the next one. In non-linear systems, the value of the whole cannot be determined by the sum of its parts. If you want, you could continue also, but you choose yourself. You would like to...
We could hang them.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Very good.
These are the parts, and this is the emergent attribute of the parts.
Oh, excellent. I love that interpretation. And then thirdly, a dynamic system changes and evolves its behavior in response to its inputs.
That's demanding.
Yeah.
Very demanding.
Yes.
How could you express the change, system change, behavior? So I would say, actually, I can't draw.
No, that's perfectly fine. And you know what?
The seed of Catan game would be such.
Thank you.
Chairs, making chairs.
Yeah. But thank you. You did a brilliant job. I absolutely thank you. Good. You know what? I tried myself, and I ended up more or less also giving up. And I think this is part of the trick. How could we visualize it, and how could we make sense of it? Could we make sense of it, and in that, as leaders, as managers, be able to act more effectively and shift the way we lead our organizations with regard to those with, oh, sorry. I'm sorry, I can, let's, oh, I'm going a wrong way here. I'm not very used to this. So, back to this one. And I actually have a drawing at the end, so we'll see and compare it, just for fun. These are the basic characteristics. Now, the basic principles in terms of how complex adaptive systems survive, how they emerge and evolve with the change, is that order emerges through the interaction among the system's parts as they evolve. And within the larger system, that means being its environment, which it doesn't control. And it's also said that cause are composed of agents that seek to maximize some measure of fitness by evolving or adapting to changes as they occur. So change is a key word here, right? We need to understand that interaction and how they interplay with those different parts of that system work together to evolve as a whole, because the value, again, the value of the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And as an example, we could take a development organization, a development team, and you would probably not know the full value of the whole team in terms of their knowledge and the way they can bring forward, work, unless you don't acknowledge that effectively. Also, another principle is that often very simple rules guide them in emerging and evolving effectively. So I'd like you to keep that in mind. Now, so that was the crash course. And we're actually now getting into my actual talk. And this is something that I have done in collaboration with different actors. I'm from Swedish Institute of Computer Science. I work there as a researcher. We do a lot of industry-driven research, so it's not with the university, it's a company. We are about 130 engineers and researchers there. And then Stockholm University has also been part of this work. I am co-supervising a PhD student who has done a lot of work in the area, and we are collaborating on this. And I also see you will also see some results of that work from Saudi Arabia and companies there that we have worked with. And the Agile Alliance, I'm also doing this work as part of one of their work groups supporting Agile adoption. And we're about 15 people meeting annually to work on the idea of what is Agile, and also scaling has of course been a big topic during the past years. But we also moved more into looking at leadership and complexity and systems thinking in terms of how can we learn something from other disciplines to be better at scaling Agile. Now, I'd like to say a few words about how I'm going to go through this. So I'm giving you a bit of background, sort of promoting the why am I doing this. And then I'm going to also tell you as a next step how we went about trying to help our managers to make sense of complexity and act effectively. And thirdly, I'm going to present the results of some of this work. So it's sort of following the Simon Sinek Golden Circle idea, the why, how, and what. Probably you're familiar with that from Apple, if not else. Now, this figure illustrates the permafrost, something impenetrable. And for me, it's a bit of showing what it is to be in a large company. There is some permafrost impeding us from scaling Agile, and that is represented by middle management, basically. How do we penetrate that? How do we get them on board? And of course, they are lacking practices for being Agile. We have frameworks, of course, coming up now. Very brilliant ones has been also talked about this morning. But when it comes to looking at the organization as a complex adaptive system, it also requires that we need to understand complexity and systems thinking, and that shift that we need to make in terms of how we look up on our organization, how we need to change as leaders in doing that. So we have a lot of developers. I wanted to put the full words out there. They're very pissed off, of course, frustrated. Now they may be very happy in their teams, but in terms of scaling it and getting it, to work for the full enterprise, it's really frustrating. So this is part of the why am I looking at this and why I think this is important. And on the other hand, the management, of course, managers are also frustrated because there is a great clash. How do we scale it? So that's the first message. The other message I'd like to bring about with this presentation is that by shedding light on a new way of thinking, the complexity thinking, I'd like to give you some advice, some ideas of how you can actually act effectively as a manager by using systems thinking and complexity theory in the ways you lead your organization. So we want to solve that permafrost. Scientifically, there is also something that I should add here, is that there are models helping us from a management science point of view, not in the software engineering literature, already giving us some guidance in terms of letting go of traditional linear ways of leading our organizations. And these are found in systems thinking, basically. Now, that field is also moving, of course, with the paradigm shifts towards complexity and complexity science and the multidisciplinary approach to looking at that. But also systems thinkers, such as Sengi, one of the famous ones, Argyris, Akov, Stacy, they also base their systems thinking models on a certain paradigm. So what researchers have done now recently, or in the past years, that they have moved on to multi-methodological, systems thinking, meaning that we need to take a holistic view and use different systems thinking models depending on context. So yeah, bringing a bit more complexity into that. And how would you, as a manager, having all those models, often quite abstract, I don't know if you have ever looked at any of the systems thinking models, how would you actually act effectively on that? So we want to make those models actionable. And especially in an agile environment, of course, where the development cycle is at best continuous, not only a cycle of 2 or 3 weeks, but actually continuous. You need to make fast decisions. You need to be able to apply those models quickly, fast. So what we wanted to do with this work is, look at the literature of management science, systems thinking, complexity theory, and bring forward, extract the best of it. Am I hearing agile packaging coming up again? The best practices, if I am, I'm not supposed to use that term because I don't think there are any best practices, actually. It all depends on context, which might vary between different teams even in a company. Now, how do we know that software development is complex? Well, first of all, there are studies, there are many highly reputed people talking about it and saying that organizations per se are complex, and software development is complex. One of them is Augustine. We also have Pellerin. I would recommend definitely to take a look at these, the writings of these people. I'll keep a copy of here already, or point to the references later if you want to. But also the Kinefin framework, which was also brought up earlier today, helps in terms of understanding the degree of complexity, if you want, in our organization. So you need to look at, first of all, you need to look at the organization as a system, a complex adaptive system, but how would you then also understand the sort of the level of complexity? And that you can do by looking at it by separating the complexity in different domains. And again, complexity means that there is no relation between cause and effect. So that is also a very, basic principle to remember. What Kinefin states very... Are you, by the way, familiar with this? Yeah, some of you. Great. But I'll just go through it really quickly. The simple, or actually nowadays called obvious, Dave Snowden changed it quite recently because it was misunderstood. The idea is that you have knowledge about the situation, the challenge, and you can also see that the effect of whatever action you're taking is going to be predictable. So that often calls in for best practice, checklists or whatever you might have at hand, and people know what to do. You sense, categorize, and respond directly. Whereas in the complicated domain, it's a bit more tricky. You cannot really know the effect because the cause and the effect are separated in time and space. What you do here as a leader is that you often bring in expertise to analyze and then act based on what you have sensed as a problem. In the complex domain, and this is where it really helps us understand that software development is a complex endeavor, is that you cannot predict the effects of certain actions, especially if you look at it from a larger perspective. And you cannot repeat what you did in a certain context in another. And there are different, of course, reasons for that. It's only afterwards, in retrospect, that you can tell why things went the way they went. So that is sort of retrospectively coherent. And the practice emerges. And it does so because you need to bring in collaboration as a leader. You cannot know the drivers of complexity. You cannot know the situation on your own. And thereby you need to collaborate and interact and communicate. So now this is bringing us to the aspect of what do you do as a leader in a complex domain, or if you find yourself in a complex situation in a development organization. And you have a very different approach, a very different strategy to act, using sort of the safe-to-fail experiments. And you need to act fast. So that is also where agility comes in very well in play here, because it sort of builds on the same principles. You need to build in feedback to know whether the action you took helped you or not, and then change, adapt, and emerge that behavior to improve it. In chaos, this is an interesting one. It's fully unconstrained. You cannot know at all. And there you also need to take a very different approach. You just have to act, and by that then sense and respond, of course, iteratively as well. Natural disasters are often a domain in this. From a company or business point of view, if you go into chaos, you can do that deliberately. And that is actually can be very productive. But if you end up in chaos undeliberately or by complacence, then it's a bad situation. You're dead, basically, as a company. And it takes a lot of energy to maintain and sustain the creativity that happens here, of course. So this is, of course, also where a lot of innovation happens. But you need to do that, deliberately and know why you're going into chaos or not. Anyways, so software development is a complex endeavor. And this is the starting point also for understanding how leaders should act. And we already touched upon that leaders need to be, open to interact, to collaborate, and communicate more effectively. So there are certain skills that comes through here that you as a leader need to acknowledge. And this is also where we looked into systems thinking and the models existing, which are proven. And could we extract some, actionable practices, if you want, that they could use here to be more effective in that type of context and help the organization as a whole to point out. Now, what we did, now moving on from, the why do we need to look at this? Why do we need to understand this? We talked about complexity. There's a paradigm shift going on in the management side in terms of how we should lead 21st century organizations. We need to look at it from the perspective of the whole, and also if we look at what that means, it needs to, that you as a leader need to act quite differently. You cannot alone do that. You need to collaborate, communicate, and interact. And from a perspective of large organization, which is sort of title of this talk, now I see I'm losing this. We also now looking, what did we do? How did we go about? Is that we looked at, traditional models in a very scientific way, academic way, if you want, and studied them in detail. We extracted the ones that we felt are most plausible candidates for helping, large agile projects in this case. But before doing that, we also wanted to understand what are the problems. And there are many, of course. Some of these from the literature came up very often, that it is often very difficult to get an overview how changes in one sub-project affects other sub-projects or neighboring projects or teams. Too many restrictions makes the whole development process rigid, and it also prevents creative solutions. The larger the project, the less flexibility, and one of the reasons to that was because of the transaction cost that increases with overhead of leading many teams. Leaders often respond with more rules, more control, and this is actually not working because the development organization is not, the individuals are not really understanding them, and they're actually bypassing them. So that is another side of the coin. So we wanted to look at how could we solve this? How can managers, do in order to avoid these types of effects? And also, so literature study, we also worked with companies, and in this case, we extracted some of the most famous models, and which ones. We also followed some criteria there for selecting them. I'm not going to go into detail by that, but with 14 companies in Saudi Arabia. This is, you don't need to look at it in detail. It's sort of a very academic table anyways, but just for the sake of facts. The sizes of these organizations, which were both private and public, ranged from 700 to 70,000 employees. We also interviewed managers of large teams with at least 7 years of experience in doing this, and also that they were leading organizations that were transferring or transforming to Agile, so that they had, at least from the point of estimating, some experience of doing Agile development. And another very academic table. I know you cannot see the text very well. I'm going to tell you, so please, no worries. We came up with 8 conventions from existing management models that we felt were relevant in terms of how to act as a manager in a complex domain to increase the interaction with your environment, and by that help the organization to adapt and evolve and of course survive the change as a complex adaptive system. Basically what you should maybe look at is that I actually should say also is that we also choose to call these conventions, not practices or rules or guidelines, conventions is also something that invites you to interact, because a convention per definition means it's a selection among several alternatives that you agree upon as a community. So that is sort of also not a specific idea where we choose to call these conventions and not rules, or because these are not mandatory, they are advisory, because they do not work in all contexts, of course. So speak their language, and these are now extracted from existing systems models. Create a culture of public benchmarking. Oops. Motivate from personal experience. Include subordinates in meetings. Combine various modeling methods. Use global definitions. Accept chaos as a driver of development. And the 8th, centralize critical rules. So this one comes from Argyris. Great culture of benchmarking is coming from Chang, Kim, and Clerk, also very famous systems thinkers. Motivate from personal experience is from, now I'm losing the name, Bood and Bandura, sorry, I forgot now. And include subordinates in your meetings is Akov, to fight power games, which impedes effective communication often in your organization. Combine various modeling methods is really coming back to Parkinson. You know, in the 40s already he stated that you cannot follow one model rigidly, you will fail. And also Checkland with his rich pictures as one of the famous systems thinkers in this area. And use global definitions is from Stafford Beard with cybernetics, of course. Introducing, you know, communication protocols on all levels, and you can use them recursively then over all the levels of your organization. Accept chaos as a driver of development comes from Stacy, the famous chaos model. And of course, Dave Snowden has also done a lot of work in this area. And centralized critical rules, meaning that basically there are models, traditional models using a management by objective sort of idea, underlying idea. Here, you would minimize those set of rules to enable teams to choose themselves how to implement them. And this is from Levinson and Thomas that are famous in this area. And I will tell you a little bit more about a few of them. Speak their language. I think it was also talked about this morning as an essential idea of how you would be able to increase the communication and an effective communication in your organization. Basically, what Argyris is arguing for is that because of a lot of emotional content in the communication, you as a manager have to, sorry, grammar here. Be careful in terms of the way you follow your teams, and in that learn their language. And I think, was it you? No, somebody else was saying also the other opposite, that even we as developers need to also understand the managers. And how do we do that? And from a management point of view, this convention really states that it's his or her responsibility to make sure that we speak each other's language in the organization, to avoid, escalating conflicts due to communication barriers or not understanding each other. So this is common sense, I would say, but it's even, within the systems thinking area, very, very well spoken for. Create a culture of public benchmarking. Well, it is said that one of the most effective ways of sharing knowledge in an organization is by performance measurement. And what is said here is that, however, as a manager, you need to also be very careful. So there are certain skills that need to be triggered here. Is that the way you approach your teams, you need to help them having a continuous dialogue around comparisons and why these are done and for what purposes. And not only that, you as a manager need to step back and let the teams come up with what is the benchmark? Why are we needing this? And how does it help us? So it's a bit of a different perspective in terms of, just putting up benchmarks and measuring teams. And it's requiring certain skills from managers in terms of how they interact with the teams. Accept chaos. This is actually one of my favorites. As a driver of development, Stacy argues that the most valued competence of a manager is the ability to deal with uncertainty, relationships, and dynamics. And by that, the manager should then adapt their leadership accordingly in different contexts. So this is also bringing forward a certain set of skills for managers to think about. And not only that, Stacy very clearly claims that as a manager, you need to be familiar with complexity theory in order to be able to leverage on chaos. And as I said earlier, if you go into chaos undeliberately, it will be bad. So we need some chaos. And not only that, very many studies have also shown that innovation goes up. And you need to, deal with that and be able to take care of that and maintain it in various ways. So there are certain skills needed here for managers to think about in the way they interact with the teams and, deal with chaos. Now, roundabouts. I think this is a brilliant example of, minimizing a critical set of rules. You have some of the white lines. You have the driving direction, whether it's left or right, depending on what part of the world we are in. And maybe some signposts showing us that these are the rules. And a lot of people know this. These are global, and we know how to go through the roundabout, without wasting much energy. It's a great flow. Not many accidents happen here. And that is a good analogy to what a minimal set of rules could do for a company or a development organization in this case, meaning that if we can extract those rules, it's up then to the teams to decide how to implement them most effectively depending on situations and empowering them in that. The results from our study are here, and I'm not going to go through them in detail here. But what is interesting is that overall, the managers that we talked to and met with, they agreed with all of these conventions. And not only in the sense that, oh, this sounds good, they actually used them, not knowing that they were actually coming from systems thinking models and that these were proved techniques. However, there are two interesting also observations I'd like to raise here. There are many observations in this study, but the one outstanding convention was create public benchmarking. And the reason here was that it was a very sensitive topic to many of the managers that we talked to. And this was basically, their motivation for that was based on cultural considerations and not knowing how to actually use those skills that comes from systems thinking in terms of creating an environment where it's a healthy comparison and creating the dialogue among teams to share the knowledge and extract the best out of that. So that was quite an interesting, and I think actually this one might go out of the ideas of how to act as a leader effectively in a complex environment. And I'd be happy to hear your comments on this one in particular. Accept chaos. It was very much so that all of the managers agreed with it, and they provided also many examples in terms of, if we show the good performance of one team to others, this is, triggering them to learn what was learned, lessons learned, and also adapt different practices to their teams or their projects. And it raised productivity in those contexts. However, what was also quite interesting was that the aspect of chaos, that actually letting go of your control is not a very easy thing. And how would you find that minimal set of rules? And then now, my time is out? 5 minutes? Yeah, thanks. Is a difficult thing. And of course, so there is some education needed in terms of, knowing what is complexity, what is a complex adaptive system, and how to act effectively in that sense. But basically, the results of this study showed us that we may have a way through the permafrost in terms of being able to scale agility by looking at complexity theory and complexity science, and looking at our organization in particular as complex adaptive system. And what does it mean in practice? Is it something like this as the drawing we got here? And I'd like to really raise the fact that I'd love to hear your comments here in terms of if these are conventions that you think would help you in increasing the interaction in your organizations. If so, why? And if not, why, of course. And that is, of course, part of the work that we're continuing in looking into this, that how can we help managers to become, what practices could be there for them to act more effectively in a complex environment. But I think we are going through this paradigm shift, and it's a difficult subject, and not even trying to understand what is complexity. And this is the drawing. Rainer, I must say, these are my 2 daughters that drew complexity for me. and just to compare, but I think this is in some respect visualizing, what it is, and can we visualize it? I mean, that may be the more important question in here. Could we visualize it? And in that, could it help us in terms of doing that? And my message to you, basically, I'd like you to remember that, is that by treating software development as a complex endeavor rather than a linear, as we have done in the past, will definitely help you master its complexity. And some of the conventions that I brought up here are hopefully of help for you to start to, interact, and by that collect better information and let your organization evolve in the changes you're going through. Yeah. Thank you very much. Oh, thank you. Oh, that is beautiful.